My name is Sebastian Hennige, and I will be the moderator of this session, which is about troubled waters, the ocean, and sustainable resource development. So I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, and my expertise is very much on the impacts of environmental change on marine ecosystems and the communities that rely upon them. So we have a really exciting panel along with us today, and we'll be hearing from them all in due course. But I'd just like to start just with a round of introductions so we all know who each other are. So I'll go left to right across my screen here. Daniel, if you'd like to unmute yourself and just introduce yourself briefly, please.
My name is Daniel Pauli. I'm professor of fisheries at the University of British Columbia, and I work really on global fisheries and their evolution, not on specific fisheries of for this fish in the Bay of Ix. And I will try to present a panorama of fisheries development later. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Daniel. Andrew, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. And I'm Andrew Rosenberg. Right now, I'm a senior fellow at the Carsey School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire, but I have been around ocean policy and ocean science world for quite a long time. And incidentally, I've known Daniel Pauli for quite a long time, which has been a pleasure. And I have mostly worked on fisheries and broader ocean policy, so large-scale ocean treaties, ocean agreements, and the like, and continue to do both science and policy work. Thank you.
That's super. Thank you very much. Gerard, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, my name is Jared Barron, and I'm from the Metals Company. And we're all about picking up these polymetallic nodules to make battery metals. And 70% of the planet is ocean, of course. And I look forward to sharing you a few of the statistics that I guess support why we should be exploring this new frontier.
That's great. Thank you very much. And next up we have Mike, please.
Good morning. My name is Mike Williamson, and I'm the president and CEO of Cascadia Seaweed. I'm located on the west coast of British Columbia in the traditional territories of the Hawaiian First Nation. I've worked in, on, and under the sea for the last 40 years, and I'm going to be speaking to you today about growing seaweed in the ocean as a regenerative crop for a number of ecosystem and climate services. And I look forward to the discussion.
That's great. Thank you very much. And as everybody in the audience can tell, we've got a whole group of people who are very passionate about their different fields here. So it'll be fascinating to hear a little bit about their varied career paths as well a little bit later on. But just to set the scene a little bit, we are living in times of unprecedented change. We have a rapidly changing ocean. Marine ecosystems are getting under threat from a variety of different sources. And we're also having to really think about how we can sustainably use our marine environment in order to safeguard our biodiversity and our seas for the future generation. Now, as we look forward, there are a lot of challenges which face us, but there are also a lot of opportunities and emerging gaps in which we can start to think about where the next generation and where you can start getting involved as well and really help us sustainably use and manage our seas going forward. The eyes of the world are now turning towards the ocean a lot more. We had COP, the Conference of Parties, last year, and there was a lot more ocean discussion there. We had the UN Ocean Conference earlier this year, and also the UN Ocean Treaty Summit as well. There is a lot of interest in our oceans now. There really is an understanding that we need to be utilizing these resources in a very sustainable manner going forward. And so it's wonderful to get involved with a lot of these different conferences, and we can talk about that a little bit later on, and the kind of careers and pathways that you can take to get there. But I'd like to very much go over to our panel members now, and we'll have a short presentation by all of them, and then I'd like to explore some of the challenges and opportunities that there are for everybody to get involved following that, and then we can see what questions are coming in as well, and see where the conversation goes from there. So first up, if we could please have Andrew.
So I've been asked to talk a little bit about the global framework for governance of the ocean, but I want to give a very, very brief historical perspective. The ocean has, for most of the last several centuries, just been used as a place that you could take things from. It was viewed as limitless. You could always extract more. It could be more fish. It could be more coastal space for your, for particular activities, industrial uses. You could put more ships on it. Frankly, the ocean has been used and still is used as the place that will dilute all the pollution that we create on land, so you don't have to worry about it. It just disappears into this big, huge, deep, wet 3/4 of the planet. So mankind's relationship to the ocean, or I should say society's relationship to the ocean, at least in the last few centuries, has largely been one of use of the ocean, taking things from the ocean that we thought for some reason we needed. There is a global framework for, if you like, governance of the ocean. And most of that is under the auspices of the UN, although individual nations, including Canada, of course, and the United States, where I am, have their own set of laws and rules for dealing with human activities on the seas. And most nations have those to varying degrees and actually put them into force to very varying degrees. It's important to recognize we don't manage the ocean, we manage the humans. So people say, well, what about ocean management? Well, the ocean actually doesn't need us. It's a bit the other way around. The overarching framework, of course, for management of humans on the ocean is the UN Law of the Sea, which almost every coastal state and every nation on Earth has signed, except for the United States, of course, because we're stupid, I guess. But the Law of the Sea is sort of a broad framework that importantly declares that the ocean is the common heritage of mankind. And you could argue with that, depending on your perspective on nature. But it is important to say that it's the heritage of mankind, not of an individual country, an individual company, an individual community, any particular race, or what have you. It is a common heritage for mankind. And under the Law of the Sea Treaty, then, there have been elaborated many other international instruments that attempt to, in some ways, carry forward the principles of sustainability as articulated in the so-called Brundtland Commission report, or the report chaired by Gro Harlem Brundtland in the 1980s, called Our Common Future, which was about the planet as a whole, not just the oceans. Let me just say something about the UN. Everyone says, oh, the UN is slow and it's bureaucratic and it's difficult and they can't get anything done. Except for the last one, all of those things are true. It's incredibly difficult to get 200 or more countries to agree on anything. It is incredibly slow because getting 200 countries to agree on something is very difficult, but it's the only game in town. So no matter how you would like to disparage the UN and global governance, no one is suggesting any alternative except, well, everybody will just do whatever they want and behave responsibly. And I think we have pretty good data on how well that works out. So some of the instruments that are contained under UN auspices are the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which now, as Sebastian just indicated, has a significant oceans component. The Law of the Sea, as I said, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is aimed at trying to protect the biological diversity of the world and includes goals such as protecting at least 30% of the ocean and of land by 2030 as a global goal. And more recently, negotiations around something called the biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And I'm going to spare you all the acronyms, no matter how much fun they are. So areas beyond national jurisdiction are effectively the high seas outside of 200 nautical miles from any coastal state, which have a very limited governance regime. So what are the issues around protecting biodiversity? Well, you know, Gerard just talked about the idea of mining for deep sea nodules. Well, what impact does that have on biodiversity in the deep sea? The answer is we don't know. How would you then put in place measures that would ensure that that impact, whatever it is, first of all, can be understood better and minimized to the greatest extent possible, so that we're not saying, after we've done all the activities, whoops, there was a lot of biodiversity and it was really interesting. It's just gone now, which has pretty much been, as I believe Daniel will talk about with relation to exploitation of the oceans, that's been the pattern up till now. We can look back and say what we've lost. The challenge for all these UN agreements is to try to say, well, can we look forward so that we don't lose it before it's too late? And the deep sea is a difficult place to work. So that treaty is under negotiation now. It deals with much more than deep sea mining. It deals with all kinds of activities on the high seas, and who will actually have the responsibility for not only managing those activities, but researching them and understanding what's happening in this vast area that is outside of any national jurisdiction. I've had the privilege of being involved in some of those discussions, and my role was to talk about what kind of science structure needs to be in place such that if you set goals for areas beyond national jurisdiction, for the high seas, you have some reasonable way to get the current scientific information into the process of making a policy decision. And the final thing I'll say is that scientists and policymakers interact in some interesting ways. So policymakers may be political and may not be political. Our goal should be that the scientists can provide information, but not assume that science is the only input to policy decisions. And policymakers should accept that scientific information for what it is. It is evidence. It is one way of knowing. There are other ways of knowing, including traditional ecological knowledge. But it's one way of knowing how the world works. And in making policy, you don't want to only ensure that the only information you look at supports the outcome that you want to come to in the end. You want to take the evidence as a driver for policymaking wherever that evidence comes from. So in terms of careers, there are the people who develop the evidence, the people who present the evidence, the communicators, those who receive it and try to translate it into policy, and those who try to get agreements. And ultimately then, if you have an agreement on what the policy is, those who, if you like, implement, people like the industry people on the ground who have to try to work and figure out what their business is under a policy that protects that common heritage of mankind. Let me stop there, Sebastian, and hand off to the next. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much for that opening talk, Andrew, and plenty that we can come back to later, I'm sure.
Hello, folks. Once again, Mike Williamson, President and CEO of Cascadia Seaweed on the west coast of Canada. The forum organizers asked us to speak on a couple of points that were particularly of interest to the audience, or hopefully. One is my background. I've got a Bachelor of Science degree and an MBA, and I've worked all of my career in and around the ocean on several coasts of Canada. I have a technical background, shipbuilding, ship repair, marine, LNG. I was also in the Canadian Navy for a large number of years, so I worked with submarines and technical things. But more recently, I've turned to the biological community, and I'm a seaweed farmer. Seaweed is not a plant, it's not an animal. Of the 5 kingdoms, it belongs in the Protista family, and it has some attributes similar to plants. But globally, seaweeds are in the ocean, around 12,000 species of macroalgae, and they're categorized as reds, browns, and greens. And mankind has used seaweed for a large number of years for human uses. Right now, most of the seaweed comes from Asia, but the Western world, Northern Europe, Central Europe, Canada, United States are growing increasing quantities of seaweed for a number of uses. Why is seaweed important to sustainable development? Well, as we heard a little bit earlier, the Earth is over 70% covered with ocean water, seawater, and right now we're only getting about 2% of human nutrition from it. So when we started the business, there was a statistic that said from the World Bank in the next 25 years, 10% of the global food mass could and should come from seaweed. And globally, demand exceeds supply. So we grow seaweed in the waters around British Columbia. And the way you grow seaweed is you put a farm structure in the water, which looks like floats and nets and anchors in a very responsible manner. You put it in about 20 meters depth of water. Your lines are at about 2 meters under the ocean, just like crops or rows on land. You seed it in December with a spool and twine. You harvest it in March and you harvest it again in fall. And by harvesting, you go out in boats and you cut the seaweed off the lines, much like a fisherman would do. And we take it back and we do value-added processing. In our business, we turn seaweed into human food. We have a food brand, Cove Ocean Foods, that does snacks and treats. But more importantly, we're putting seaweed back in a circular economy, back into the agricultural world. Seaweed as a feed additive for cows can reduce harmful methane emissions from cows. Globally, all the cows in the world produce the same as methane as all the cars in the world. And by feeding them with seaweed, just as a small percentage, 2 to 5% daily as an additive, it reduces methane output from cows. It makes the cows healthier and it increases their feed conversion efficiency. Another very important use of seaweed is in land crops, not as fertilizer, but energizing the soil and healing the soil. A product is called a biostimulant. And today there's several companies around the world making hundreds of millions of dollars a year in revenue by responsibly extracting value from seaweed in the ocean, turning it into a product and taking it back into cycles. Now, seaweed can also be used for bioplastics. I mentioned human food. It can be used in medicine. It can be used in pharmaceuticals. It can be used for energy. And the importance of any one company is to find a way that can extract the value from the seaweed, but doing so in a sustainable manner. And in fact, we like to go a little bit further and talk about doing it in a regenerative manner. That is to say, when we put a farm in the sea, we like to leave the ocean in better condition than when we found it. And fortunately, when seaweed grows, it only needs sunlight and what's in the ocean to grow. There's no additional fertilizer. And as it grows, it sequesters carbon, it uptakes excess nutrients, it reduces acidification, it produces oxygen, and it produces habitat. Folks might have heard a lot about people using seaweed for carbon sequestration. The science is there, the results are still being tabulated, and we won't be making any kind of claims until science backs up what we're doing. To come back to the theme of the conference, I think it's important for the youth and the next group of leaders today to take advantage of the environment where they live, the resources around them, and folks around them that they can turn to for advice and guidance. If you live near the sea and you have a passion for it, then exploit it. If you live in the prairies or in the mountains, there's other ways to help sustainable development. Of course, I'm only going to speak about the sea because having lived on the east coast of Canada and the west coast of Canada, I've always been in around the sea and I know what it has to offer. It's a very delicate balance and it's important for all of us in industry that are making use of the sea to do so in a sustainable manner. So I would encourage our attendees to get a book, learn about seaweed, get on the web. There's many, many good aspects, and find out how seaweed, as an example, fits into all the resources we extract from the sea. Everyone would have heard about fish from the sea and shellfish from the sea. Well, seaweed has a place as well. And with 12,000 species, we really only know about 50 of them. So it's important to do biodiscovery and learn what amazing properties that this element, this product can have, and how we can use it all in our lives, how we can use it to support our economy, and how we can use it to help heal the earth. So I'll stop there and go on to the next panelist, and I look forward to an energized discussion about all of our presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mike, and wonderful to hear about the opportunities around the seaweed farming as well. So we'll keep going on the talks for now, and then we, as you say, we can come to discussion afterwards. So Daniel, if we could move to you next, please.
So I could repeat the importance of the ocean for us humans, but it is the cradle of life, and much of the biodiversity of the world is in the ocean, etc. But I'm a fishery scientist, and I will concentrate mainly on that aspect, the fact that we extract fish from fish and invertebrates, and now algae from the ocean. And we have done this for thousands and thousands of years. And there have been cultures that built entirely on the ocean, the Greek Thalassoca Sea, or the First Nation of BC, which even though they were technically in a Stone Age, could build, because they didn't build metals. They were not using metals that they forged. They had such an excess or supply of fish, or excess, that they had to invent ways to get rid of it. The excess was given in the form of potlatch, where the chiefs could share their wealth with the people in their community. And some villages in BC exist where have been documented, where people have lived 5,000 years without stoppage. There is no other culture that maintained villages supplying themselves from the sea for 5,000 years or more. There are cities that were so long, but they drew resource from the outlying provinces. Now, all the energy that was used by these cultures was actually the sum, at most, of 1 year of solar energy, because the most rowing, most moving around was muscle power. And muscle power, muscle power, means food that was grown and could not be kept for a long time. So actually, the crops that were grown a year could, in the subsequent month, drive the whole industrial or the whole production complex. Now, that applies also to fisheries. In 1880, in the 80s of the 19th century, ships, the first steam trawlers, were unlashed by around the British Isles, were with the use of fossil energy. That means rather than depending on 1 year's worth of sunlight in your area, you can tap into millions of years of accumulated energy. And this allows these trawlers to punch into the coastal ecosystem in a way that they never experienced. The trawlers at the time were very inefficient compared to our trawlers now, but they punch into the coastal system in such a way that within a decade, the coastal waters of the British Isles were emptied of fish, to the extent that now you have about 5% of the biomass that was initially there, and this biomass consists of very different animals, fish and invertebrates, completely different. So these trawlers had to move out to the open North Sea, and later to all the way to Iceland, where in the 1950s, British trawlers were in a war with Icelanders who didn't want them. And I was personally involved in helping introduce trawlers into Indonesia in the mid-70s as part of a German development project. Now, what this expansion does is a characteristic of industrial fisheries. And why? Why so? Because this is a manifestation of the fact that we are an invasive species. We emerged from Africa, or at least some of us emerged from Africa, some of you, I should say, I could say, about 80,000 years ago, and peopled rapidly the other continent. America was last, and Oceania was really last. And this peopling went along with the annihilation of the local fauna. The large animals were destroyed, and many of them, at least, for example, in North America, only buffalo and moose were left as big animals. Even everything else was wiped out, from mastodon and mammoth and horses. Everything was wiped out, and in Europe as well. And only in Africa where the big animal left, because they had co-evolved with apes with sticks, so they knew that to be careful around apes with sticks. Anyway, so expansion is the thing that we do. We are the ultimate invasive species, and the last thing that we were not invading, we had not invaded until the last century, was the ocean, the open ocean, and we invaded them. What? With our punching fossil energy machines. And what does it mean? It means that we can fish anything, anywhere, at any depth. There is no limit of season. There is no limit of cold. There is no limit of time, because we can freeze the stuff. And to detect where the fish are, we use the instrument of war that we have developed to hunt German submarine in World War I and World War II. Hydroacoustic, pinger, spotter planes, and all of this technology, the electronic that is in a modern fishing boat corresponds to the electronic that we use in spaceships almost. And obviously we have fought a war against fish, and we have won it to the extent that large fish, say above 1 meter, have become extremely rare. And we have developed a taste for it. For example, until recently, it was only because of the Chinese propensity for shark fin soup that we went after the sharks. But in the meantime, a taste for shark fish meat has developed in Peru, in Brazil, in other countries, and sharks are now hunted for their meat in addition to their fins. So we cannot leave this impact that we have. We cannot leave it to companies and who want to maximize their return, because they operate on short term, because they can translate, they can shift from investment in this fish into investment into terrestrial activity, into the other activities. Also because they can move places. So if we want to manage, to use the term that Andy said we shouldn't use, if we want to manage any part of the ocean, we have to limit fisheries. We have to limit fisheries, and there are various ways of doing that. We perform stock assessments. We assess what the stocks are doing, and we try to limit effort. Generally, what we ought to be doing first is not give subsidies to the fishing companies. subsidies is the most absurd thing that you have, because to a certain extent, the resources help us manage them, because when they go down and a boat cannot cover its cost, including return to capital and labor, cannot cover this cost, then it tells us, or nature tells us, don't fish here. Come back in a few years when I have recovered. And without subsidies, that would work in principle. But with subsidies, you can absolutely ignore this message that nature gives you and continue fishing, because your costs are covered by the subsidy itself. So it was very disheartening that, again, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, has failed to limit subsidies in the last agreement, because this is an agreement that is so wishy-washy that it has so many loopholes. You can drive a Russian tank through it. We have to limit our impact in the ocean, among other things, by creating marine reserve, place where we don't fish and where, therefore, nature can reestablish itself. One low apple, at least technically, would be to close the high sea to fishing, to all fishing. It seems absurd, because when you come up with a thing like that, closing the high sea to fishing, but actually most of the fish that we catch in the high seas are migratory fish, tuna, and they migrate back and forth between the EEZ of countries, between the part of countries that, the exclusive economic zone of countries which they can control, and the high seas. If there were no fishing on the high sea, which can be monitored very easily by satellite, you would have a more equitable distribution of the fish between countries, instead of having a handful of countries like South Korea and Spain and Taiwan and China fishing in the high sea. You would have the same resources being caught by 30 or so countries that are coastal. So that is something that will be considered, and to the extent that people think it is crazy, remember that exclusive economic zones, when they were first proposed by some Latin American countries in the 60s, were considered completely crazy. They claimed patriotic sea, so-called patriotic sea, and 20 years later we had the law of the sea, which gave every country 200 miles away. And last thing that I want to say is one of them is, how about scientists are supposed to write, as Andrew explained very well, to provide evidence. But actually it's not our only role. Providing evidence to policymakers is the route where we express ourselves as scientists, because peer review limits us as to what we can say, because what we should do is not in our remit. So that is not in scientific papers, not what we should write. But we can actually do this by working with NGO. Then NGO environmental NGO are nowadays a force multiplier for conservation of the sea, and scientists can, especially young ones, can get involved with their NGO community, which badly needs scientists, because most scientists in fisheries, at least, are working for government, which may have very limited goals. So let's say like that with regard to the ocean. Last point. The big challenge for the ocean is global warming. That is a challenge that cannot be resolved by partial solution. The big challenge is to reduce greenhouse gas emission, because fish are extremely sensitive to change in temperature, because they breathe water. I cannot go into detail of that, but fish are not mammals, we breathe air. There's no problem for us. We get the oxygen we need from that. And but fish breathe water, which has much less oxygen, and anything that make respiration difficult for fish wipes them out. And I'm afraid that much of the, if we mess around with fishing, exploiting minerals at the bottom of the sea, and we stir up lots of sediment and throw it into the water column, fish will have problem breathing. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I just have a few slides that I want to walk through. If I just say next slide, would that be okay? It's important that we remember that, you know, of course, as Daniel just talked about, we must address global warming. We must think about the planet as a planet. You know, we can't just focus on oceans or land. We have to think about an integrated planet and look for solutions. And of course, 97% of all biomass life is on land, compared to 3% in the ocean, yet the oceans cover 70% of our planet. Next slide. And when it comes to metals, because if we are going to address global warming, then we need to move away from burning fossil fuels. We need to reduce CO2 emissions. And if we look at our planet, when it comes to the important battery metals like nickel and cobalt and manganese, more than 70% of the identified resources are in the polymetallic nodule fields in the CCZ, 1,000 miles off the coast of Mexico. So most of the metals that are identified, like 70% when it comes to nickel, cobalt, and manganese, are in our oceans in this one little resource. Next slide. Which is helpful that it's concentrated. Now, there are ocean metals get categorized, bundled together, but there are different types. And at the metals company, we're very focused, exclusively focused on polymetallic nodules in the CCZ, known as the Clarion-Clipperton zone. It's in the abyssal zone. It's about 1,000 miles off the coast of Mexico. It's more than 4,000 meters deep. But there are other metals like cobalt cross and seafloor massive sulfides, which have a lot more biodiversity associated to them. They involve mining. You have to go and turn big rocks into little rocks to recover them, compared to polymetallic nodules, which lie unattached on the ocean floor, like golf balls on a driving range. Could we go to the next slide, please? And this was to be a video, but we have thousands of hours of this type of footage. And what you'll notice is no flora. So we don't have plants in this part of the abyssal zone. But of course, there is fauna. You just don't see a lot of it because 70 to 80% of it is bacteria living on the nodules or in the sediment. Next slide, please. And if we think of a scale, and at one end of the scale where extractive industries could take place, we're talking about the abyssal zone. And the one thing we know that to get to this ore body, it lies on the ocean floor, so there's no need to deforest. There's certainly no risk of any child labor. There's no communities to move, which is very important. And there's no risk to the carbon that is sequestered in the sediment. At the other end of the scale is where all of the growth in these battery metals is forecast to come from, which is Indonesian rainforest. So we're talking 10 to 13 grams of biomass per square meter. And I know biomass is an introductory measure, but per square meter compared to 30 kilograms per square meter where we're pushing these extractive industries into Indonesia. Next slide, please. And there is life there, of course. There is much megafauna, and that life is what companies like the metals company are busy researching right now. Next slide, please. And some of the things that we worry about is what's the impact when we remove nodules? What about the organisms that depend on them? But there are ways to mitigate these impacts because we must remember that there is no perfect solution. There is no solution that involves zero impact. What we have to do is identify our set of impacts, see how we can mitigate those impacts, and then compare them to the known set of impacts that are currently underway with land-based extractive industries. The other thing we worry about is the sediment that we disturb. How far will it travel? Will it impact surrounding life? And then we also worry about where do we return the wastewater? Because we separate the nodules from the sediment on the seafloor, but then we use water to carry them up the riser pipe, and we have to return that water. It will be filtered water. But this is where science has such an important part to play, because we saw MIT publish an important paper 2 weeks ago, which found that the sediment only rose around 2 meters off the seafloor when they were harvesting nodules last year. Now, this is important science, monitored by independent scientists with lots of toys in the water, and because one of the things that harms our efforts is exaggeration and talking about impacts in a speculative manner, when actually what we need to do is good quality science. Next slide, please. And we're doing that science with the help of some of the leading voices in the ocean science category. I sometimes hear people to say, yes, but you're paying for it. But someone has to pay for it. So yes, we're paying for it, but we engage the world's best, whether it's from the National Oceanography Center or the Natural History Museum, the University of Hawaii. We'll have more than 100 studies completed by the time we lodge our environmental impact study. And I must say, the results are encouraging so far. Next slide, please. We are also engaging people like the CSIRO and NIWA, the equivalent in New Zealand, to help us with adaptive management systems, to help us identify what are the things that we really must measure, what's important, what's less important, then how do we put parameters in place that we can operate inside of. And these organizations have had decades of experience with Great Barrier Reef and other fragile ecosystems where they've worked to make sure that recovery and protection can take place. Next slide, please. Now, for biodiversity, of course, protection is very important. And there's around 1.3 million square kilometers in this area known as the CCZ that is under exploration licenses. But the regulator, the International Seabed Authority, has already set aside just under 2 million square kilometers in protected zones where nodules will never be collected. And so that is some protection around biodiversity. Next slide, please. And just to put it in scale, I said before about 1.3 million square kilometers is under exploration license. This grid is a reflection of the ocean, 360 million square kilometers. And each year, bottom trawling impacts around 5 million square kilometers of coastal productive waters. And it's a challenge. Its impact is great. But just to put it in perspective, assuming 50% of all of those exploration licenses moved into production, which I think is very unlikely, very, very unlikely, then the annual impact can be seen in that tiny little square. It's about 0.25 square kilometers of annual production. So, you know, we're not talking about raping and pillaging our oceans. We're talking about we're fortunate that Mother Nature put this concentrated resource in one particular patch. And next slide, please. And we have funded life cycle analyses, and other studies have also been found that look at a whole range of impacts across a whole range of areas, including CO2 emissions, which showed we can reduce CO2 emissions by more than 90% when we build a battery cathode from our polymetallic nodules compared to land-based alternatives. We can reduce waste and tailings to zero because we don't have deleterious elements. We don't generate the nasty tailings that land-based ore bodies do. We only use around 10% as much water. So a whole range of impacts are compressed if we could use polymetallic nodules. Next slide, please.
Wonderful. Gerard, I'm just going to stop you there because we've got the last few minutes of the session coming up now. But that's wonderful. Thank you very much. And everybody here has brought up some really important points. I'd just like to start just on your point there, that there's no perfect solution. I thought that's actually a really important point to bring up. We've also heard about how we've had a war with fish and we've won that to a certain extent, but we need to think about how we go forward from here. We are taking resources from the ocean. We need to think about how we can do that in a very sustainable manner. And something which has come up from a few of the questions in the chat as well is this whole science to policy link, and how important it is actually having that good science and how we can translate that into policy, but even from the aspect of how can we police that and start to bring this through into sensible pathways going forward. So we've got a few. Andrew, you wanted to jump on that science to policy pathway point.
I did, and I think it goes from Gerard's presentation, because there were a lot of, Gerard gave a lot of statistics, but for people thinking about, so how would I factor into any of this kind of work? I think for every one of the issues Gerard raised or Mike raised, Daniel or I, there's a huge number of unknowns. So are the numbers that Gerard presented and said, okay, this is a small fraction, is that really a small fraction? Because of course you wouldn't make policy just for one company that might work someplace. There may be 10,000 companies that ultimately want to exploit nodules. There may be 10 companies. There's a huge number of unknowns. And so when you think about, so how, as a young professional, how might I work in either science or in policy? It's really asking, how could I reduce the number of unknowns so that we actually can achieve sustainability? It's one thing to say, I think it's going to be okay for your company, Gerard, or Mike, or for me when I was working for government. I think it's going to be okay, but it's always, and what am I going to do if it isn't? And how would I actually know that, in fact, if I was working on the management side for deep sea metals, yes, I have a reasonable basis for belief that we could move forward, or I have a reasonable basis for belief to say, Gerard, that all sounds very good, but I don't buy it. There's not enough evidence there. And I'm not getting into a policy debate. I'm just saying that's the place where we need a lot more people to be engaged to study, because everything you said about deep sea metals and everything you said about seaweeds, you could have applied to fisheries. I don't know what, Daniel, 100 years ago. Oh, there's a lot of fish out there. We don't have to worry about it. It's only a small fraction of the sea. We're only one company. We only have a net that's tiny compared to 75% of the earth. There's no impact of doing this. All of that was said about fisheries.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Andrew. And I think we've got about 30 seconds left. So I'd just like to bring it all together at this point. And we've seen that there's a huge amount of challenges but opportunities which are facing us as well, from the science to policy angle, from how we can actually start to be sustainably growing new resources such as the seaweed, how we need to be thinking about how we manage our war on fish going forward and the sustainability of that, how we govern that, but also how we can use our deep sea resources as well. And time is not on our side. This is an urgent situation which we end up with. The world is changing faster than we've ever seen really in our geological history, but the opportunities are there now for us to think about how we can engage. There's a whole way in which we can engage with our oceans, and I think it's an exciting time to be doing this engagement. So I'd just like to thank all of our speakers today for coming along. It's been wonderful to hear about all these different aspects, and to the audience, please do approach us with questions. We are all very excited to talk about our research and our different lives, so please do, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.